New York Times, copyright, 1923, by the New York Times Company. New York, Thursday, July 13, 1933. Hitler ties scene with Czech Jews. Organ of Austrian Heimwehr reports direct descent on his mother's side. Forebears of same name. Woman who left Czechoslovakia for Austria, declared a sister of Chancellor's grandmother. Wiles to the New York Times, Vienna, July 12. Frequent intimations and reports that Chancellor Hitler of Germany was connected with a Jewish family of the same name culminated in a 3-page story tonight in the Heimwehr organ, 𝗧𝗿𝗍𝗶𝗁𝗱𝗏, claiming proof that Herr Hitler was directly descended on his mother's side from a Jewish family of that name in Czechoslovakia. There were 1 or 2 missing links in the chain of evidence, but the story was sufficiently sensational to induce the reputable Vienna Tagblatt to declare, "The publication of the story in the Heimwehr organ entitles the world to expect that the Nazis will not simply ignore it, but will furnish a very definite reply." The 𝗧𝗿𝗍𝗶𝗁𝗱𝗏 article, as the result of investigation of a story cabled by the Prague correspondent to the New York Times on July 6 concerning a Jewish family of Hitlers in Polna, Czechoslovakia, traces Jewish Hitlers. The first discovery was made by Alexander Basch, Jewish registrar of Polna, who traced in his books the names of 10 Jewish Hitlers who were born in Prague between 1800 and 1831. The gravestone of one member of the family, with Hebrew inscriptions, is still standing in the Jewish cemetery in Polna. Shortly before his death recently, Herr Basch summoned his best friends and sold. "I have established that the great enemy of our race, Adolf Hitler, is of Jewish origin." Herr Basch's researches showed that 4 members of this Jewish family of Hitlers in Polna, the 60-year-old Abraham Hitler, his sons Jacob and Leopold, and his daughter Clara, moved to Vienna, where they were all later baptized. Clara Hitler went to Spittal in Lower Austria, said Herr Basch. She was a sister of Adolf Hitler's grandmother. Hitler's parentage. The parish records of Braunau on the Inn, Adolf Hitler's birthplace in Upper Austria, give his parentage as father, Alois Hitler, formerly called Schickergruber, who changed his name because of an inheritance. Mother, Clara, daughter of Johann Pölzl and Johanna Hitler, born in Spittal in 1860. The weak links in the chain connecting Adolf Hitler with the Jewish Hitlers of Polna are that no evidence beyond assertions attributed to Herr Basch that Clara Hitler was a sister of Adolf Hitler's grandmother has yet been produced to connect the German Chancellor's grandmother with the Polna family, and that in the records of this family there is no mention of any Johanna Hitler. The only proof thus far that the Jewish Clara Hitler, who moved to Vienna, ever went to Spittal, is the assertion of Herr Rerich, the local historian of Polna, that letters have been found written by Clara Hitler from Spittal to her relatives in Polna. Such letters have not yet been produced. Now, there are some rumblings that Adolf Hitler may have had some Jewish blood imparted to him by a Jew named Frankenberger, who supposedly had a liaison with his grandmother Maria Anna Schickergruber, 1795 to 1847. Indeed, a prominent attorney in New York City, Gerald Morgulis, wrote a book called The 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 Rather, Hitler was really the product of an adulterous relationship between his mother, Clara Polzl, and a Sabbateer and Frankist 1861 September 21st, 1928, who was Hitler's real father. The Frankist Sabbateers had a ritual on the 9th of Av, which is observed by Jews as a fast day commemorating the destruction of the first and second temples. This night, the Sabbateers secretly observed as incest and adultery night. However, there is a persistent rumor that Clara was artificially inseminated that night. Since the Jewish calendar is lunar, the 9th of Av can occur in July or August. Checking the calendar, the 9th of Av, 1888, the date of Hitler's probable conception, fell on July 20th, 1888, approximately 9 months prior to April 20th, 1889, the birthday of Adolf Hitler. A 1933 New York Times article dealing with Hitler's alleged Jewish origins maintained that there was Jewish blood on the strong side, Hitler's maternal grandmother, a family which converted to Catholicism from Judaism in Vienna in the 1850s. Rabbinic court testimony claims that not only Hitler's real father was a 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗏𝗏𝗏, but his maternal great-grandfather as well, i.e., Clara's maternal grandfather, who fathered her mother out of wedlock. There is evidence that Hitler maintained close contact with 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗏𝗏s throughout his lifetime. In fact, his personal astrologer Erich Johannesson, murdered in the woods outside of Berlin in February 1933, was a 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗏𝗏 who was called the Prophet of the Third Reich and Magician of Berlin. His real name was 𝗍𝗆𝗆, born in Vienna in 1889, and he was the first cousin of Moritz Steinschneider, 1816 to 1907.
But when you have fact after fact after fact, here's a book that came out in 1999, available everywhere, called Hitler's Vienna, A Dictator's Apprentice by Brigitte Heymann. Now I'm going to read you a few things from Brigitte Heymann's book, Hitler's Vienna, because it deals with Hitler and was Hitler Jewish. It refers first of all to a book by Hitler's lawyer for much of the Third Reich, or a pamphlet actually, and this guy's name was Hans Frank. Hans Frank, F-R-A-N-K. Hans Frank was half Jewish. This is Hitler's lawyer through the Third Reich. Now, as we're going to see, a nasty fight broke out between the world powers, which everyone knows, called World War II. And Hans Frank was hung at Nuremberg, as many of the Nazis were, because of there was such a animosity going between the factions at that point. And incidentally, I should mention here, we need to, I thought I made this clear, but I want to make sure that I made it clear. Just as we're not talking about the average German who joined the Nazi Party, we're talking about the Nazis, the top Nazis, Hitler and the boys. We're not talking about the average Zionist Jew in the world then or now who wants a homeland. We're talking about the top Zionists who were cooperating with the Nazis, which is probably less than 0.1%. Now, I have theological objections to the way Israel has been founded and developed, and I'll mention that briefly, although that's not the main focus of this tape, through referring to the books to Father Fahey. But we're talking here about that minute element of super criminals who were cooperating with each other on all sides. Well, anyway, Hans Frank was Hitler's personal attorney. Half Jewish, he was the former governor general in Poland. And he made, according to Brigitte Heymann on page 48 and 49, his last pamphlet, Make Truly Explosive Material Public. Shortly before he was executed, so this is kind of like a deathbed confession, he wrote his memoirs, and then she gives it in German, Im Angesicht des Gaugens. I probably butchered that, meaning facing the gallows, or it's often printed as in the face of the gallows. Hans Frank, where it says, where he mentioned that the following bona fide scoop. At the end of 1930, he wrote Hitler had shown him a letter commenting that this was a disgusting blackmail story of one of his most repulsive relatives concerning Hitler's ancestry, unquote. The relative had dropped hints to the effect that, quote, in connection with certain remarks in the press, one would be well advised not to broadcast certain circumstances of our family history, unquote. Brigitte Heymann goes on to say the point was that, quote, Hitler had Jewish blood in his veins and therefore had scant credentials for being anti-Semitic, unquote. We'll get into this. This was William Patrick Hitler who was blackmailing the Fuhrer, and we'll get into that. Frank claimed that after Hitler directed him to check confidentially into the matter, he found out, quote, from all kinds of sources, unquote, which he did not want to divulge, the following. quote, before the child was born, Hitler's grandmother Schnickelgruber had been a cook in Graz in the household of a Jew by the name of Frankenberger, that she had become pregnant by the son of the house, and that for the next 14 years she received child support payments for little Aloy, that's Hitler's father. There had been a, quote, correspondence between the Frankenbergers and Hitler's grandmother, which went on for years, and whose basic thrust it was that everyone had tacitly acknowledged that Schnickelgruber's illegitimate child was born under circumstances that obliged Frankenberger to pay child support. Frankenberger, again, being a Jewish banker. Now that's the end of the quote. According to his own racial laws, Hitler thus would have been a, quote, quarter Jew and not been able to produce the necessary ticket into the Third Reich, quote, the proof of Aryan descent. Frank was conspicuously ambiguous in leaving the impression that he did not find this theory implausible. And then she goes on and on from there, and you can read the whole thing. But Frank says in other parts of the pamphlet that when he went down to Hitler's birthplace to see what investigators could find out, that he found out that Hitler was Hitler, from a number of sources, that Hitler's birth certificate and so forth indicated that this was his ancestry. Although, again, I've given you the name of the pamphlet in the face of the gallows, so someone can check it out in case I've slightly misstated a nuance here. Now, Hitler, as you remember, when he went into Austria, incidentally, went down and bulldozed the graveyards down there in near his birthplace in Brunel on the Inn, and destroyed the records. And as Ratisbonne said, when we find somebody who's under the microscope destroying evidence, we usually call him guilty. Now, by that I don't mean that guilty is someone who would be Jewish is guilty, but Hitler, in trying to be the head anti-Semite in the world, trying to cover up, it looks like he's trying to cover up some facts. Now, we also go on to here, I want to read one other part from Bridget Heyman here, and this has to do with what she found out in some of her other researches, which I think is quite incredible here. And this is about the time that Hitler was being raised to power in 1933. She says, now scores of reporters started searching for Hitler's alleged Jewish relatives. It was discovered that the name Hitler appeared among Jewish families in the small town of Polna in Moravia in Poland, and that there was a Jewish merchant in the 𝗧𝗍𝗱𝗏 district who claimed to be a relative of Hitler via Polna. In Warsaw, some Jewish families by the name of Hitler officially applied for a change of name, adverting to the anti-Semitic German politician. This is on page 46 of Hitler's Vienna by Bridget Heyman. The summer of 1933, this is when Hitler had just come to power, brought new headlines. Lidovo Noviny in Prague reported on July 6 that in Polna people were mentioning an Abraham Hitler from the 18th century as Hitler's ancestor. Deutsch Freihardt of Saarbrücken wrote on July 6, quote, the Jewish Hitler family, with sources. Österreichisches Morgenblatt, as I say, I'm probably butchering these, wrote on July 13th, quote, Brown Hitler and his yellow spot. I guess it was kind of a play on words of the Brown Church or something. Vorarlberger Wacht wrote, quote, so he did have a Jewish grandmother after all, Mr. Hitler. No, referring to Mr. Hitler. And she gives sources for all these. In the meantime, 𝗶𝗶𝗁𝗶𝗶𝗃 had become an editor for Österreichisches Abendblatt and published new revelations starting on July 12, 1933. For example, on July 14, 1933, quote, awesome traces of the Hitler Jews in Vienna was the subject, with photographs from Hitler graves in the Jewish section of Vienna's Central Cemetery. In other words, gravestones that said Hitler on them, of Hitlers who had died, and a cookbook by one Rosalie Hitler written in Hebrew. On July 19th, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's newspaper even printed the headline, Hitler's Jewishness officially confirmed. This time the newspaper published the pedigree of a Jewish Heidler family in Polna, and she goes on, and I would say that she makes the case that that headline was exaggerated there slightly. What I'm pointing out to you, though, is all the different arrows pointing in the same direction here. So at any rate, And it says in a footnote that Brown Hitler was a play on the brown shirts. So this is just, again, a part of what she repeated. But these Hitler revelations of being Jewish were all over small papers in Germany and other countries at that time. So here's a whole book. This is an establishment historian, and she's not trying to make the case that I'm making, but that's evidence she puts in her book in trying to put to rest this idea that Hitler was part Jewish. Well, as 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗁𝗱𝗆 says, we thought that all socialism was of Jewish origin except Nazism, National Socialists. And by the time you get done looking at all this research, I think we can conclude that all socialism was of the Jewish source in the 20th century. Now, in a minute, we're going to finish this section off by reading from The Jewish Connection, a book put out in the last few decades, probably about 1970s, by 𝗚𝗚𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃, which is just a lot of fun facts about the Jewish connection to things, and the Jewish connection to Hitler in this book. But before that, I have got to go back to read, as we're going through here, it occurred to me I forgot to read two important things. The first thing is remember the Bridget Heyman book, Hitler's Vienna, came out in 1999. Listen to this. Hitler had this what do we make of this? If the man's not trying to hide something, what do we make of this? I mean, Hitler's an intelligent guy, detail-oriented, and all that kind of stuff. She quotes on page 48, Hitler did not want to hear anything about relatives. I've got no idea about family history. She's quoting him here, according to one source at the William Patrick interview when Hitler and William Patrick, the nephew from Ireland, met. In that area, I'm an absolute dunce. Even when I was younger, I didn't know I had relatives. I've only learned that since I became Rights Chancellor. This reminds me of Madeleine Albright saying she just found out she was Jewish when she became Secretary of State. Can you imagine that? A family with survivors, Holocaust survivors, not mentioning it to her till she's Secretary of State. But he says, again to repeat, I've only learned that I have relatives since I became Rights Chancellor. I am an entirely non-familial being, a non-clanning being by nature. That's not my cup of tea. I only belong to my folkish community. And then on page 51, she quotes, going to this interview where he invited William Patrick Hitler to come see him when he was threatening to blackmail him. When Hitler became famous, his poor Irish relatives, whom he did not know, saw their chance to make money and gave interviews to newspapers in England as Hitler's relatives. Subsequently, in 1930, now this is before he came to power, Hitler had 19-year-old Patrick, whom he had never met before, visit him in Munich, where he told him and his half-brother 𝗍𝗏𝗍𝗏 that he forbade them to do things like that, to give interviews about the family. He is supposed to have said that the family should not believe they could become famous at his expense. They're quoting him here from a report of the meeting, I guess from William Patrick Hitler. Quote, although she makes it clear in here, she gives a source if you read it, if you go to the book and so forth. It's footnote 215, but she says, quote, you're going to do me in, Hitler is talking to William Patrick Hitler. Now again, what do we make of this from a grown man when I'm about to read? You're going to do me in. How carefully I have always kept my private life and my personal affairs from the press. People must not know who I am. They must not know where I'm from and who my family is. Not even in my book did I allow one word to come out about these things. Not one word, Mein Kampf in other words, not one word about his family. And then all of a sudden there's a nephew. They will start investigating. They will stick snoopers on the tracks of our past, unquote. In a newspaper interview in 1939, Patrick Hitler even said that his uncle had started sobbing and in his anger shed tears.
When I began this investigation, I was completely skeptical. I assumed, without any doubt, that he died in the bunker. Frankly, I don't think a guy like Adolf Hitler gives up that easily. If he's got a way out, wouldn't he take it? He went for the long shots. He always went for the long shots. And, you know, I find this, frankly, appalling that the historians have left it at that presumption that I've lived with my whole life. We're fed history and expected to believe it. Based on what? History books say without a shadow of a doubt that Hitler died in the bunker. I can safely say, with the evidence I've uncovered, that that's not true. History is not fixed as we've received it.
Yeah.
I will never stop looking for the truth. I never take facts at face value, and I never will.
בגלל ביטול עבדות החוקית, אז נוצרו מגרעות עכשיו, כי אין אחריות על הנכס הזה. בעזרת השם זה יחזור. הם ירצו הגויים להיות עבדים שלנו.
זהו הרב 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗱𝗏, ראש ישיבת בני דוד בעלי.
הכי טוב להיות עבד של יהודים. הם צריכים להיות עבדים, רוצים להיות עבדים.
הישיבה הזו מיועדת לבוגרי המכינה הקדם צבאית, המוכרת והיוקרתית בציונות הדתית. רבים מהם מגיעים אליה לאחר שהם מסיימים שירות צבאי.
במקום שהוא יהיה סתם מסתובב ברחובות ועושה שטויות ואלימות ומזיק אחד לשני. עכשיו הוא עבד, החיים שלו מתחילים להתנהל.
לפי הרב קשתיאל, האדונים הם היהודים, העבדים הם הערבים. החלוקה לא מקרית, זה עניין ביולוגי, בעיות גנטיות.
יש מסביבנו עמים כאלה, בעיות גנטיות. תשאל ערבי פשוט, איפה אתה רוצה להיות? הוא רוצה להיות תחת הכיבוש. למה? כי הם יש להם בעיה גנטית, הם לא יודעים לנהל מדינה, הם לא יודעים לעשות כלום. תראה איך הם נראים.
והנה התורה כולה, תורת הגזע.
בוודאי שיש גזענות, מה אנחנו לא יודעים שיש גזעים שונים בעולם? מה זה סוד זה, מה זה לא נכון? זה נכון, מה לעשות?
בעוד יומיים עם ישראל יציין את יום השואה, בין היתר את החלוקה של הנאצים לגזעים, עליונים ונחותים, והנה בגרסה העברית.
כן, אנחנו גזענים, אנחנו מאמינים בגזענות. יש גזעים בעולם ויש תכונות גנטיות של עמים, וזה דורש מאיתנו לחשוב איך לעזור להם. יש הבדלים בין גזעים, וזה בדיוק סיבה להשית עזרה.
מי שמחה להחליט מי זה מי?
אני רואה שאני מגיע להישגים הרבה יותר מרשימים ממנו.
ראש מוסדות בני דוד, הרב אלי סדן, עומד מאחורי הליהוק של הרב רפי פרץ לראש איחוד מפלגות הימין. כעת המועמד המוביל לתפקיד שר החינוך. רק הרב פרץ הורשה לשאת דברים בפני תלמידי המכינה לפני הבחירות. נתניהו ובנט סורבו. בני דוד מהווים את התשתית הדתית, הערכית והחינוכית של מי שמיועד להוביל את מערכת החינוך שלנו. כיצד הם רואים את השואה?
השואה באמת זה לא שהרגו את היהודים, זאת לא השואה. כל התירוצים האלה כמו זה אידיאולוגי או זה שיטתי או כל זה לא שטויות. זה כיוון שזה נבע מתוך אידיאולוגיה במידה מסוימת זה יותר מוסרי מאשר סתם שאנשים רוצחים. הומניזם, כל התרבות החילונית זה אנחנו מאמינים באדם, זה השואה. השואה באמת זה להיות פלורליסט, כן? זה להאמין באני מאמין באדם. זה נקרא שואה.
זהו הרב גיורא רדלר, וזו ההגדרה שלו לשואה.
שהקדוש ברוך הוא כבר הרבה שנים צועק שנגמרה הגולה, אבל אנשים לא מקשיבים לו, וזאת המחלה שלהם שאותה צריך לרפא על ידי השואה.
שימו לב לשיעור המדהים הזה, תחת הכותרת היחס לשואה. כך הוא מחנך את תלמידיו על הנאצים ועל היטלר.
ההיגיון של הגרמנים הוא נכון יחסית לעצמם. זאת אומרת שקבוצה מסוימת באוכלוסייה היא זרע הפורענות לכל האנושות, בגללה כל האנושות תלך לאבדון, הם מרעים לאנושות ולכן צריך להשמיד אותם. האידיאולוגיה הזאת נשמעת לך לא הגיונית? רעה מאוד. זה לא נשמע מוסרי. משה רבינו, אכזרי רשע כמו היטלר? לא. למה לא? יש דבר אחד רע בעולם וזה להיות צבוע. משנה לך אם הורגים אותך עכשיו מסכין או כמו שהרגו את הגג או שהורגים אותך בתא גזים, זה אחד.
התלמידים נדהמים, מנסים לסתור את הרע והוא ממשיך בשלו.
בוא נתחיל מהשאלה אם היטלר צודק או לא. 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 הוא האדם הכי צודק שיש. ודאי שהוא צודק כל מילה שהוא אומר. באידיאולוגיה שלו הוא צודק. יש עולם גברי שנלחם, שעניינו כבוד, שעניינו החוות לוחמים. ויש את העולם הנשי, הרכרוכי, המוסרי, לתת הלחי השנייה. ואנחנו חושבים שהיהודים הם אלה שנושאים את המורשת הזאת, מנסים במילים שלנו לקלקל את כל האנושות, ולכן הם האויב האמיתי. עכשיו, הוא צודק ב100%, חוץ זה שהוא בצד הלא נכון.
האמירות האלה חוזרות על עצמן שוב ושוב בשיעורי בני דוד לאורך השנים. לא פליטת פה, אלא אג'נדה סדורה.
ראשי הבית היהודי כהנא, סדן ופרץ, עושים שימוש במכינות הקדם צבאיות כדי להפנים בחניכים ערכים משיחיים. החומרה שבדבר נובעת מכך שמשרד החינוך, שאמור להיות אחראי על התכנים, נמצא בידיים שלהם.
ייתכן ובקרוב מי שמזוהה עם התפיסות של המכינה והישיבה הזאת יהיה אחראי על חינוך תלמידי ישראל.